It's appropriate that Nir was recognized by Doug to ask a question in the last session because Nir is the moderator of the upcoming session. I hope those panelists will be sort of queuing themselves up. Nir, I guess, needs no introduction, but he is a leading geroscientist out of Albert Einstein. And this is a fascinating topic on whether we have reached a tipping point in the global longevity ecosystem. We've had people talk about how geroscience seems to have made multiple efforts to break out into the popular consciousness, in the mass, in the population. And the question is, has something changed? Are we now starting to climb the steep part of the S-curve? Nir, are you there? Can you come online and introduce your august panel, please?
Yes, thank you. So Thomas, also in favor of the last session, I have a mitochondria in my background.
Yes, I stole that idea from Nir. I give it credit.
And and so I'll stay and remind everybody that I'm one of two scientists in this panel. And first of all, Thomas and Adrian and Zen and everybody, again, this is a very useful approach you had for an aging problem, and thank you for giving aging such a geroscience, such a good platform here. We really appreciate that. The panel that we have, I think it would take the whole hour to really introduce them well, or their 10% of their achievements. I'll make some points as I ask them the questions, but please, they're posted there if you don't know them. And let me make some comments as I see. Oh, hi, Sergey. Good morning. Hi, Matt. Hi, Victor. Oh, and Mehmood is here too. So let me make some comments. And I'm from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and being at Einstein, we're always aware of relativity. It's funny. I'm reading the New York Times this morning. Everybody in the world is complaining about how their governments handled COVID. Okay, yet clearly, on a relative matter, some countries have really done very well compared to others. So this relativity is also important when we discuss aging, because it's a global effort where relatively some places are doing worse than other. I would also say that the relativity for me was really great. Thomas, I think relative, this time geroscience really made progress compared to Metabesity the last time. So things are going well. And really, I want to introduce this concept that we're trying to fight, this old-fashioned double toilet that clearly and relatively to be on this double-deck toilet, it's worse to be down than up, right? And our effort is to build a better toilet, put it somewhere else, and put it in parallel and not one above the other. I think, so we're going to discuss it, but in a more specific term, but I want to just introduce this concept because it makes it really very important for us from a geroscience perspective, that if we go and look at death of COVID around the world, and this is China and Italy and the United States and EU, when you're over the age of 80, your chances of dying are 200 times more than when you're 20. Okay, it's clearly an aging epidemic that made it so bad. And I would point out that there are two gerotherapeutics. Okay, one of them is metformin, that actually decrease 9 papers around the world. People on metformin had less hospitalization, and much less mortality. They had third the mortality of people not on metformin. And John Manick just revealed on Monday her study where she gave a rapamycin analog on an mTOR inhibitor, and was able to prevent all sickness and death in old age home when 40% of the control non-rapamycin receivers had a lot of cases and death. So with this in mind, let me go first to Matt and kind of summarize a little bit of the geroscientific point. And Matt is the director of the Nathan Shock Center at University of Washington, and his research spanned from yeast to mice, and now he's doing clinical studies in dogs. Actually, he's the head of the Nathan Shock Center. And Matt, can we start with examples of gerotherapeutics that can be repurposed now? I want to start with what we can do now. Give example of 2-3 gerotherapeutics that can be repurposed now.
Sure. Well, thanks, Nir. So you mentioned, I think, two of the leading candidates, or probably the two leading candidates in this space of repurposing molecules that we already know about for gerotherapeutics, rapamycin and metformin. I think both have a lot of potential and seem to broadly impact the biology of aging across multiple tissues and multiple organs. So I think that the real challenge, of course, is, how do we actually definitively test whether or not metformin, rapamycin, or other potential gerotherapeutics like NAD precursors or senolytics, how do we actually test those, from a clinical perspective, and actually get good quantitative data really demonstrating that these interventions work in people, right? I think we're all very confident in the field that they work very well in mice, especially rapamycin, but how do we actually move that into the real world? And so, you mentioned one of the strategies that we're taking is to test starting with rapamycin in companion dogs, where you can actually do clinical trials in a reasonable time frame. Of course, you're spearheading the TAME trial. So I really think that's that's where the action is at right now. There are a long list of probably another dozen or so interventions that thinking in the neuroscience world. Some of them are natural products like alpha-ketoglutarate. I think there's accumulating evidence that alpha-ketoglutarate is an intermediate in the TCA cycle, can have positive benefits on the biology of aging in preclinical studies and laboratory mice, and Brian Kennedy and others are trying to move that into the clinic as well in people. So, I think there's a lot of moving parts right now, which is exciting, but I really see us, sort of the inflection point that we're at is really trying to move these things out of the laboratory and into the real world and get some data in people, in companion animals, that they are actually impacting the biology of aging.
Right, and we can get back to that. So, Matt, we're on the same cycle now, and we have just reviewed 12 applications for pilot and feasibility for the Nathan Shock Center. Those 12 were amazing. Actually, let's say 11 were really amazing. We would have liked to fund them, but we have ability to fund 3 grants for $35,000. Share with me your frustration. What would you do with more money? How much do we need to increase the pipeline of our knowledge and the pipeline that will lead to gerotherapeutics? And how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, well, I think, as you said, frustration is the key word at times, although I would say that's mixed with a lot of optimism. So at the same time, you and I have been in this field long enough to have been frustrated for a long time at how difficult it is to get funding for geroscience research. But this is a really neat time because there is money flowing into the field. It's not as much, I think, as any of us think that we need, but there is actually an influx of funds into the field. So I'm on the review panel for these impetus grants, which are these, philanthropic funded grants that can be given out for geroscience research. And so it's like you said with the shock center proposals, there are a lot of really good proposals coming in, but we're in the nice position in that particular program that Martin Borsch has spearheaded to be able to fund some of those things that wouldn't have gotten funded before. So it's a mix of frustration and optimism. Nir and I were on a panel, Metabesity panel yesterday, where I sort of put forward the idea that I think that geroscience should be funded at the same level as NCI, the National Cancer Institute at NIH, about $6.5 billion a year. You could certainly make an argument that geroscience maybe should even be funded at a higher level, but I think that's kind of where we need to be aiming for, that sort of level of funding, and that would really move the needle. That would really have a big impact. And one area where it would have a huge impact is what I was just referring to, which is actually doing clinical trials, right? I think that is the bottleneck in a lot of ways right now. You know this, Nir, your frustration level must be sky high with how long you've been trying to get the TAME trial fully funded, right? That trial should have been funded 5 years ago. We should have had rapamycin trials 5 years ago. I've been pushing rapamycin for Alzheimer's disease for the last 10 years. So that's where I think a lot of the influx could go and be used in a very effective and efficient way, is to actually move some of these things into the clinical trial realm so we can get good, solid data.
Terrific, Matt. That was a real good review. I couldn't have said it better. In fact, you should do those talks always. I'm crying. But nevertheless, I share the optimism. I share also the feeling that we're catching a wave, and actually we're going to demonstrate that right now. So Mehmood, you are an MD, a trained physician, or an MD fellow in nutrition. Then you went to the industry and you were vice president of a pharmacy, and then you got to Pepsi, and then you got to be the vice chair of Pepsi, and then we got you to the longevity biotech world. Your experience is just amazing, and the things you've done are such amazing. So can you explain to us how to take gerotherapeutics from, and I'm kind of quoting you from invention or IP, and make it into innovation? And is there an increase in VC and entrepreneurial activities in this space?
The easy answer is, if I knew how to take geroscience and make it into an innovation, I would have made more money than even Sergey. But it's obviously been a tough challenge, but I'm actually also, like Matt, quite optimistic. And let me explain that. When I think about invention versus innovation, I think about innovation being something that changes a person's life, other than the discoverer or the author of a paper. Inventions remain as inventions until they move into the market, one way or another. Whether they're a service or a product, doesn't matter. That's innovation. And geroscience is yet to do that. And so the question that you're getting at is, what is the hurdle? And one of the hurdles is obviously financing and funding, and we can touch on that. The other is the path to market. How do you take products and bring them to market when there isn't a regulatory framework to bring them to market? So I don't care how much money you throw at it until there's a regulatory path. And unfortunately, regulatory science doesn't always move at the same pace as academic and industry science. So we've got to work together to help shape that, right? So there's a key need there. Another is, in particular for aging, how do you know something works before it gets on the market and you do a 10-year, 20-year trial? And the challenge we have, and I think some of that challenge is understandable, but sits with the field itself, which is, do we have an agreed point measure of efficacy? The so-called biomarker debate that's been going on for decades. And unfortunately, you cannot just rely on the private sector to fund biomarker development. Traditionally, government funding has not been that good at funding biomarker development. I mean, I recall from my nutrition experience, it took a lot to work with the NIH just to get the biomarkers of nutrition and disease initiative. Victor, you might recall the whole BOND initiative was very difficult to launch and ultimately had to get donations into the NIH. So there's a number of major steps that need to happen. Now, challenge is defined. You can't end it at that and say, so now then the so what? And the so what in my mind is that there is increasingly patient capital that is being allocated. I think there's increasing recognition that this is a challenge. While it's difficult, there isn't really an alternative. I think everybody on this call will recognize that if we continue taking care of aging people in the same way that we always have done, then nobody has enough budget as a Department of Health or a Ministry of Health to do it. So somebody's willing to try something different. So that encourages me. And the final piece on this is there's a lot of new thinking and new blood coming into this because the size of the talent pool is growing. With no disrespect to the existing talent pool, but it's going to take a village. This is not going to be solved by an individual, some eureka moment by one brilliant scientist, but it's going to take a village, many of whom are actually mentees of people like yourself, Nir and Victor and Matt, that you're trainees, but they're staying in the field to develop it and grow it. So I'll stop there. We can get into this in many discussions, but there's reason to have optimism here.
Yeah, and I have to say, I got an email from the graduate office yesterday. The new graduates at Einstein, the new graduate students, 50% of them chose a geroscience lab. 25% of Einstein's geroscience lab, but clearly young people are very interested in this, and this is, I think, thanks to Matt and our colleagues to really make geroscience so interesting. So, Sergey, you have the Longevity Venture Fund. You're also a writer. You wrote this terrific book, one of 3 best books that were written in the last years on aging. And you have great descriptions of technology. Can you give us like 2-3 examples of where, and you know, guys, on this round, we're staying on now, what's going on now. We'll get to the future late, but what's exciting today in technology?
Well, where do I start? First of all, I'd like to agree with Mehmood that it is very difficult to invest today in longevity and longevity technology, and starting from geroscience, simply because our regulatory framework is not there, right? So that's why aging R&D in broader terms get somewhere around $2 billion a year. While, I mean, if you look at oncology related R&D, it's $80+ billion a year. So I do agree with Matt as well. So aging is actually much bigger as a problem, as a root cause of so many age-related diseases. And we would, first of all, we would need to have a change in regulatory framework to support and do a step change in terms of the number of billions and tens of billions of dollars that should be put in the science and technology and startups in this field. So that's one. Second thing, if you look at what is, you know, most promising from an investment perspective today, well, finally, we have the academic framework that we can use. It's not perfect, 9 or 10 hallmarks of aging, depending where you look at. But starting from 2013, it's great that we have this framework. At least from investment perspective, we can follow the scientific side of, you know, startups and different ideas from the young generation before and when we're making this an investment decision. And the other point, which has been raised by Mehmood, I think we all came to the point when we appreciate the complexity of the problem. There's no feeling in a room, whether it's investment full of investors or scientists, that we're going to have one silver bullet, which is going to solve the aging problem. Just appreciation the complexity of the human biology and multiple dimensions that we need to take to solve this problem. So if you ask me, like, what is hot today from investment perspective, 3 things. One is this whole field of genomic medicine. And this is super promising. Just a lot of interest from our fund and other longevity related funds. So it's gene editing, gene therapy, epigenetic programming is like super interesting today. And we do receive a lot of interest on that when we introduce entrepreneurs to other investors. One thing. Second is organ regeneration, our ability to regenerate organ in broader terms. And whether it's using animals to regrow organs or 3D printed, 3D bioprinting for organs, or using our lymph nodes for organ regeneration technologies, like a company called Genesis based in Pittsburgh. This we think also, not probably now, but in the next 3, 5, 7 years, will make a huge change. And so in terms of our look at human body and mind and extending its lifespan and health span. And third one is longevity and appeal. And we already discussed it on this panel, whether it's rapamycin, metformin, or it can easily be the drug, and I'm pretty sure Margaretta will cover that, developed with the help of artificial intelligence. That's like a third piece that we're looking at, longevity and appeal, new class of drugs, which will focus on aging and its core rather than on individual disease.
Thank you very much. That was good. I want to make the point that there is an interest in genetic editing and everything like that, but there's so much that we can do in aging before we get there that we don't have to go that far. I mean, we have this between us, maximal lifespan of humans is like 115 years, okay? And we die before the age of 80. So there's a lot for us to progress in this. And it doesn't mean we cannot pass, right, the 115 and get much farther, but it's just interesting, the interest in the technology and availability of tools now and their how you use it is disproportionate. So let me go to Victor Dzau. And Victor, besides all your achievements as the president of the National Academy of Medicine, to pick up on aging and longevity was just so great for our field. So thank you for that. So tell us a little bit, what are the challenges in preparing the world, okay, for health span and the longevity revolution?
Well, I want to take off where Matt and Mehmood and Sergey talked about, because I see the field of neuroscience and longevity as one that we're all recognizing. We're not looking to extend lifespan, but to increase health as people age. And that's going to be critically important, because if you listen to carefully about how they define what's investable and what in fact will be a hit, they're still very traditional. Regenerating organs. Well, you don't need to be aging to regenerate organs, right? And genomics, you don't need to be aging to genomics. So these are tools which we look at because that's where the market incentivizes people. And that's where the regulatory pathways say, yes, you can have a product that you can actually bring to the market. I think the whole field needs a very different look altogether. And let's face it, even though today we're highly enthusiastic, as I am, in the field, it's still an early field. I went to the Buck Institute celebration of 30 years when they look back and we look at where we are today. Yes, the science is now phenomenal in the molecular pathways, etc. But that's not the end point. As been said, how do you translate those observations into the definition of healthy longevity? We don't have those ability to define them. So your metformin and rapamycin trials are so conventional. No wonder you have to raise 30, 40, $50 million, right? Are there other ways to look at health longevity, not by the standard lack of disease or how long do you live, but in fact, looking at many other things. As the UN Decade of Aging says, it's actually intrinsic capability, your environment, and actually how you function. So if you look at that, now suddenly you're redefining the field altogether. And I say that's what we need, right? In addition to the traditional pathways of blocking, regenerating, you name it, there's got to be a whole new way of looking at things whereby you can reach your endpoint much faster And that's why I thought Sergey was going to talk about in technology, because let's face it, digital technology and all those things have really transformed the way we live, and therefore the health condition environment where we live. I would say that belongs to healthy longevity, in my opinion. And there, the investment and pathways are going to be faster than traditional phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 FDA pathway. So that's point number 1. I think Mehmood talked about innovation. He's spot on. What we need is innovation. And therefore, you think about innovations, we're missing out a whole field of people who are innovators, who are not in the traditional laboratory pathways, right? And so what about those? And so I think the critical mass is not there. I'm sorry to tell you that, Nir, you are not 30 years old. Even though Albert Einstein, you have good results, if I go on campus at Duke or Stanford, ask you, what kind of research do you work on? Cancer, brain, cardiovascular, aging doesn't come up anywhere. So you need to mobilize a whole generation of people looking at aging as cool research that actually leads to a whole variety of things, academic career, entrepreneurism, you name it. Which really leads me to think about, how to mobilize this field and how to reimagine this field altogether. And I think what we're not doing is reimagining the field. So we are a little impatient. We know the traditional way, I got rapamycin, why don't I just prove it? Versus reimagining how we take this field forward. So this is why we at National Academy of Medicine took a different look. Very much influenced by the Gates Foundation and the late Tachi Yamada to say, why don't we just throw out seed money for bold ideas without asking feasibility, without asking for preliminary data, just pick the best one. As you know, Nir and Mehmood, many of you are engaged with our work, looking at how to pick them. We score differently. We use gold, silver, and the bronze, or don't fund. And then we go through 3 rounds, but we're looking for innovation. And what we hope to do, and by no means do I say I have the answer, is to bring in a lot of innovators, particularly younger people who come in. And we're not restricted to one area of science. Physical, engineering, digital, biomedical, or social science all fit. And I'm happy to tell you that we have a very good profile of those who are picked. And importantly, so we have people working at AI. They look at retinal imaging that can predict Alzheimer's. All that stuff is another way of looking at, from a more traditional way of looking at drug that can make a difference. And then we have a tier project, as you know, that if they're successful, they get more funding. J&J has given quick fire. The European Investment Bank has put in, willing to put in millions of dollars for successful projects to help them commercialize. And of course, we look at, as Sergey is doing, a grand prize for those which are breakthroughs. All we're doing is try to do things differently. Because if you go through the NIH route, and by the way, Matt, the budget's up to 3.9 billion. That's not bad. I remember talking about this a few years ago when I said it's got to go up, but a lot is in Alzheimer's, the more traditional way of looking at things, right? So I think the world is recognizing how important this is, but it's not there yet. And we as innovators, entrepreneurs need to lead it in a different way, in addition to the more really nice basic molecular pathway genomic research. So I'm going to stop here.
So thank you, Victor. And I just want to say that maybe I'm not 30, but for a 100-year-old, they say that I look pretty good.
Yes, yes.
And I think so. Matt and I are less in the lab these days. The people who are in our area are in the academic are all innovators and doing good things. It's not that there's anything. I wouldn't say that we're going in any way, except that the writing of grants for the NIH is going the same way. The review is the same way. But right. I think the innovation is out there in our centers, and that's good to see. So, Margaretta, last but not least at all, you are a long time follower and leader and advisor in longevity, and you've been looking more at the AI space, and you were working around the world. So tell us a little bit of the interest in longevity around the world. What groups are out there? Are they working together? What is the motivations and the factors that you find out there?
Okay, thanks, Nir. So I'm working on 12 different initiatives around the world, and I'll tell you about 4 of them just because we don't have too much time. They're all really exciting, and they're all very serious initiatives that all involve very senior people in the biggest companies. So they're really interesting to work on. The first one is a longevity finance hub that's being developed in India. And it's being developed in India's first smart city. It's called Gift City. And this is considered a special zone by India, and it's tax-free, and there's all kinds of benefits for companies to do business in this city already. And even already this year, they've had over $100 billion of banking transactions in Gift City. So, and all the big banks have a presence there. So they're building a longevity finance hub, and they've selected a group of 12 people to be on the expert committee to develop a roadmap for the hub. And I was invited to join the committee. I'm the only person from outside of India who's on the committee. And everyone on the committee is head of a major financial institution. So the head of Bank of America in India, the head of Julius Baer, Prudential Insurance, all of people from the very senior people in the government. And we're designing a roadmap right now. And once we have it, I think they'll make it public. And that's really, really important because all of these people can really do big things because they're in very, important positions. And they're all very interested in innovation in fintech. So on our first meeting, I told them all about all of you guys and all the work you're doing. So I told them about Nir's work, Matt's work. I told them about, the Buck Institute. I told them about Sergey, because most people I talk to aren't really familiar with what we're all doing. So they were so excited to hear about all the work that's going on. And then I gave them a lot of articles I've written about this. And so that's a very, very interesting project. I'm under NDA, so I can't say much about it right now, but it's fantastic. Then the next hub is in Latin America. And the reason this hub was suggested is because a year ago, I was invited to speak at Innovation Week in Mexico. And it's a big annual event that's it's sponsored by the Mexican Association for Pharmaceutical Research. So all the big pharma companies come, 60 pharma companies are involved. And they invited me to come and do a roundtable. And I suggested that we do it on longevity. And they'd never done anything like that before. So I did the roundtable, and everyone really loved, learning about all the, the longevity landscape and all the different treatments that are being developed. And so they said, let's have a whole a Latin American longevity summit where we invite all of the pharma people from all Latin American countries. So that's set for November 11th. So a month from now, it's the first Latin American longevity summit. And it's a 3-hour event. And I've invited 4 longevity scientists who we all know to come and speak. And then we're having investors from who are very, the most prominent investors in Latin America who invest in precision medicine and AI and healthcare and things like that. And they're going to talk about their plans for longevity. And we're also having like the Carlos Slim Foundation and people who work in public health. So it's going to be a great summit, and everyone's invited. It's on November 11th. And then another project I'm working on is with Bloomberg. And a year ago, Bloomberg had a longevity summit, and it was a private invitation-only event. And it was sponsored by Bloomberg in Singapore. And they invited 450 CEOs from 14 Asian countries. And all the CEOs were heads of all the biggest banks and financial institutions. And they, and I gave the opening panel, and I talked about and all of, all your work and everything. And that was so successful that we're doing it again in January. And so that's a really, Bloomberg is doing lots of, they're very interested in disruptive innovation. And so, and they can connect us with all of the biggest, Fortune 500 companies all around the world. And that's what they're doing. And they're, and they have great speakers at these conferences. And then another area that's really interesting to me is the Middle East, because I've done several conferences there, and they're not longevity conferences, they're AI conferences. So they're AI and healthcare conferences, but I'm always asked to, host a panel, and I always invite longevity scientists to my panel. So I invite, Alex Zavaronkov and people like that. And then once people hear Alex talk about what he's doing, they want to have a whole longevity conference. We're doing this again in March. So in March 2022, we're having a big AI for healthcare conference in Saudi Arabia, and we're having a whole track on longevity. So I'm inviting all the longevity scientists to talk about how they're using AI in their research. So anyway, so I have a lot of other great initiatives, but the thing that's important to remember is that all of the people who are involved in these initiatives can really do big things because they're in such high positions in all these countries. And also all the governments are involved. So the Mexican government's involved, the Indian government's involved, the senior people in Saudi Arabia are involved. And, longevity is part of like the Saudi 2030 vision, and also for the vision for Oman. So when I do before I do these panels, I always read their vision. They're all their, the description of their vision, and they always include longevity. And I always tell them, you guys, this longevity is part of your vision. So anyway, so that's all I can fit in right now, but I've written 250 articles on these topics that I'm talking about. So if anyone's interested in reading about these initiatives and having links to, the websites about them, or reading about the people, like all the committees, the expert committees, you can just go to my website and read in very detailed articles about them.
So Margaretta, we're in our mind, we're thinking we're creating this wave in the United States and it will get to the world, but you've been creating waves on your own, and we are probably in a hurricane season by now. Thanks so much. That was so interesting. So let me, I think, quote Bill Gates. I think it was Bill Gates who said we're overestimated what we can achieve in 2 years, but underestimating what we can achieve in 10 years. So let's look at what non-technical developments will have an impact in the decade. Okay, so let's get over our current situation. And by the way, I'll still ask some questions, and you, as you've done, you can feel free to ignore me and answer whatever you want, but I just want to make sure that we're covering some things. And Victor, I want to start with you because I'm interested to know what do you do with the politicians and with the awareness of the political arms here and around the world to make sure that they'll be receptive to us?
Yeah. Well, we still have a long way to go, despite the fact there's more awareness of politicians and government leaders, and I think the public on this issue of aging, and of course, particularly supporting healthy longevity. We still have a long way to go. As you know, in US, we don't really have a plan for this. We have an assistant secretary. I'm not even sure who he is right now, but we did have one. And there's really no focus on creating a strategy addressing this issue. And in many countries, with the exception of a few like Singapore, this is not really center to issues. I think COVID has both given us an opportunity as well as detraction. The opportunity, as you saw in the data, you showed that the older population is particularly vulnerable, and that by making them healthier, that in fact the case infection and fatality will go down, and that obviously is a very critical issue. there are many associated issues, COVID, that have, shall we say, unmasked the issues of vulnerability of elderly. Loneliness, social isolation, mental health, you name it. So I think it is a great opportunity to look at why this population is vulnerable and why healthy longevity is so important to society, not to only measure lives, economic cost, you name it. But at the same time, I think getting the world's leadership a focus on this issue is not necessarily easy. As you know, many studies have looked at preparedness index, and I think most countries are not prepared. They may prepare one way or the other. They're not. So there is a real need to get this right in the top of the agenda. Now, we're competing for a lot of different agenda. I'm very much involved with COVID, as you know, through the G20 panel, through GPMB, I serve, and others. And I would say raising money for COVID acutely, for vaccination, for treatment, for diagnostic, has not been easy, even though we see this as a crisis. And then, of course, other areas such as mental health and aging are all looking for where to land. But I do think it's really important. So what we're doing, Nir, as you know, is to do a roadmap, which is a commission, which Mehmood serves on, that has together many people from different countries who are actually leaders, not only in the field, but leaders, not only in aging, but also previous government officials, et cetera, together to look at what's needed in the domains of social, economic, behavioral policies, health and healthcare issues, science and technology. Actually, coming back to this, if the countries realize how much science and technology can only create a market economy for them, but also great improved health, that's great. So Mehmood will tell you, we've been working for quite a while with multiple consultation workshops. A report will come out early spring, in which we now have a dissemination strategy to meet with, in fact, country leaders and to meet with community workers to really take this whole set of ideas forward. I should point out that John Wong, the co-chair, is from Singapore. He is the CEO of NUS Health System. And of course, Singapore is deeply involved. Singapore is funding many of our initiatives. And so that's, and Linda Fried is the other co-chair. So I would say this answer to this is that we got to really look at evidence-based approach, looking at how to move forward. We are working with WHO, Decade of Aging, and to really create this in the face of politicians and decision makers.
Terrific. Linda Fried always says the only nature resource that increases in the world is elderly people. So it's good that we have initiatives. Mehmood, I want to focus now a little bit on the biotech side. First of all, for gerotherapeutics, don't we need to think of a different runway? Shouldn't we educate investors that this is a little bit slower because of the challenges of first looking for a disease and maybe getting to aging later? What would be the consideration in your mind that are different? That's one thing. And second, if you could also talk about the fact that there's lots of drugs that are out of patent and are not out there because they don't make economical sense for pharmaceutical. A lot of those drugs are gerotherapeutics. How can we deal with that?
I wonder which drug you're thinking about, Nir. I would never be able to guess.
Oh, so I'll tell you, no, you wouldn't guess. I'm talking, you see the mitochondria behind me. There is a mitochondrial derived peptide called humanin that was patented in Japan years ago. It has huge effects on all models, and also genetics of humans show that it could protect from Alzheimer's and other diseases. So no, you're not what you don't know what I'm thinking.
Look, this is a very profound question, because underlying it all actually begs the question: how do we fund this innovation? Okay. Our traditional venture capital model, which has been very powerful in industries that are rapid in progression, can come to market and scale very quickly and relatively low in regulation, it's a phenomenal model. I mean, this Silicon Valley essentially was created by that model. Parts of that model work well in biotech, especially when the science has progressed far enough along that the timeline for return is within that so-called proverbial 10 years of the life of a fund. All that's fine. I'm not going to suggest by any means we change that. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we supplement it with? The challenge, of course, we have is the government level funding typically either takes on very early discovery work, nobody bridges, and I'm not just talking about the valley of death, but just bridges. And the second is the private sector, to your point, doesn't want to fund essentially the repurposing of patent expired drugs. Unless you can create a new formulation, put it in a nanoparticle or something and sort of still maintain its quote commercial value. However, we're going to have to change that. And we're going to have to change it by asking ourselves, how do we give innovators more time? You know, a lot of people think, you know, what do innovators need? Actually, even more than capital, they need time. And the two are very intricately linked because it is time that running out that leads to capital running out. Let's not kid ourselves. And the longer it takes to develop something, the shorter the patent life on the market, the less the ROI and so-called NPV. And so when I think about it, I say, if we can give innovators time, they actually will get there. And it isn't just throw more dollars, because sometimes dollars doesn't accelerate the timeline. So I just want to distinguish this. So the question really, in my mind, is how do we allow innovators that timeline, either to bring something to market or test something that might be about to expire, may not have the traditional ROI, but has a massive impact on society. And so along those lines, we've already, I mean, you know, Victor and others on this call know well, this has been a challenge in infectious diseases in the emerging world, developing world. This has been a challenge in some areas for vaccine development because the markets may not give the same ROI that traditional treating another hypertension drug or another cardiovascular drug or diabetes drug would. If we're going to change that, we're going to have to change that equation. And I think this is where alternative funding mechanisms need to come to the forefront. Now, my own bias is that traditional philanthropy on its own is not going to be sufficient, because we have to, you know, philanthropy coupled with the ability to fund pre-commercial to commercial actually will move the invention into an innovation. And somehow linking the two in a coordinated manner is a key part of that. We have a lot of silos. My biggest worry in this, and I think I'm going to use the example because I saw some numbers recently of, you know, the number of investable, quote, I'm quoting somebody, ideas available hasn't grown proportional to the amount of capital coming in. And that's because a lot of that capital is actually chasing the same fewer ideas. They haven't brought it out yet, either because of timeline or IP and a whole variety of other things. So let us be careful. Let us not just throw capital at it without changing the supply side of the ideas. You have to do both. And I think one of the great initiatives that Victor just described at the Academy of attracting these riskier ideas to actually be tested. Sometimes you don't need $20 million grant to do it. You need rapid iteration. And then what's important is once you've identified in that pipeline what's good, is how do you carry them through to the next step? And if we can do that effectively, I think we're going to move this field. And we'll make it attractive for others to enter. It's that partnership of these sectors on the financial model will change this. So let me just stop there. Happy to get into more, but
I just want to get some numbers. We launched this grand challenge with the global competition. We're now in our second year. In year one, we have 1,500 applications globally. And we had 8 funding agencies covering 50 plus countries and regions. That including EU, Japan, UK, China, Singapore, and now Chile, Hong Kong, and Canada, and many others. I'm missing some names. But anyway, we are now in round 2. So we are attracting a lot of innovators. Now, I can't tell you, of course, what the long-term outcome are, but there's a hunger out there that if you give, and Sergey, love to work with you, because really, and Mehmood's helping us in thinking is just to cast a broad net. And we're putting out very small amounts of money. We're talking about putting more. We're starting with $50,000 a pop. Now, having been the chancellor of Duke, I would say it matters to younger people, particularly if you're not in the classical biomedical research pathway. But
I want to.
Victor, could you just comment also? I mean, I don't want to comment on the Academy's work, since you know it far better than I. But I think the other model that's worth mentioning is the fact that you're crossing geographical boundaries.
Yeah.
Political boundaries.
So maybe we have less than 10 minutes, and I want to let other talk. So let's go to other boundaries. Margaretta, what are the biggest challenge to mainstream this interest? How do you go on with the wave to affect lobbying or politics, or what are the challenges that you see?
I see 2 major challenges. The first one is branding. Just this month, there were 2 great articles in mainstream media. One was in MIT Tech Review, and the other one was in New York Times, and they were about longevity. And the articles were great, but the headlines talked about pursuing immortality. So I know a lot of people who didn't read the articles because they had these crazy headlines, and that's what the articles were not about pursuing immortality. They're about aging research. One was about Altos Labs, and the other one was just this week, it was an interview with Dave Sinclair. So that's a big problem, that mainstream, smart journalists keep talking about immortality. And in fact, just this week, just yesterday, Eric Verdin did a really good tweet on the subject. And he said, no serious longevity people are talking about immortality. It's not that we don't want immortality, it's a distraction from all the work we have to do. So that's number one. Let's talk about longevity and precision health and things like that. And the second thing is the way the media represents longevity is completely wrong. And the person in the world who knows the most about this is Sergey Young, because about 3 years ago, he produced a roadmap, I think with the X Prize, and it was a fantastic roadmap. And there was not one picture of old sick people in the entire roadmap. The people were vital and healthy. And he was trying to, and I've always thought this, if we're going to get mainstream acceptance, don't show Jean Clement at 122 years old, very sick, because it scares people. Nobody wants to extend their life and be sick. So Sergey, everyone should see Sergey's roadmap, because when I saw it, I sent it to everyone I know. And I said, this is what longevity is. Sergey, do you remember we talked about this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, Sergey is the best in the world at the branding. And that's so important, Sergey. It's really, go ahead.
Right. And I would add, immortality is not helping us, but the other group that's not helping us is the anti-aging, because that makes us snake oil, and things like that. And it's hard to fight then what the editor wants to be the title to be, but those are really important points. So I want Matt and Sergey, in the last few minutes, I'm going to ask you the same question. What is the biggest therapeutic thing that you expect from Sergey from a technology point of view, and Matt from a biological point of view? What do you think is really the most cool thing that's going to advance in the next decade? Sergey, let's start with you.
So I think it's just this whole, well, first of all, thanks for the compliment. And Victor and Mehmood, we would be delighted to join this effort. Victor, I was so inspired by your idea of bringing more and more young talent to the field. And it's actually, funny enough, it relates to what just been said by Margaretta. I mean, you look at like any article or, media clip about what we're doing, and it's just, full of very old people trying to struggling to make exercises. Obviously, we would like to help them, right? But we work in which much broader challenge, much broader population. And I do agree, it's not only communication challenge, it's just a matter of our everyday decision and allocation of our time and resources. So Victor, we would be delighted to join what you're doing. And what I actually like about today's discussion, and we went far beyond US, right? US obviously is 25% of the world economy, and we have a problem with declining lifespan even pre-COVID. So that's both risk and opportunity. But the most delightful things for me was just looking at these innovation hubs that we all discussed today, being India, Singapore, Japan, China, Latin America. And I do think we need to embrace and use it. And it's a little bit like in history, within the whole history of medicine, you don't know where innovation or discovery will come from, okay? And sometimes it's just a side effect of completely different efforts. So I couldn't really predict what technology will bring us. Obviously, it's the wearables, AI, and use of AI in diagnostic and drug discovery. We're very optimistic about this whole thing. But I do know the change in the healthcare and in change within our journey for healthy longevity for the world will come not only from old players, but from new players as well. So technology, startups, entrepreneurs will bring this whole kind of new direction of ideas. And only with combination of science and technology, we will be able to solve this problem.
Yeah, an example of technology is putting elderly in hyperbaric oxygen, which sounded ridiculously dangerous. And actually, I get it now. It could be promising, and there is some evidence for that. We don't know what, we cannot stay in our concept anymore. Matt, you have the last word. Excite us. What's
all
coming?
right? Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to just agree completely with what Margaretta said about branding. And I think from the scientist perspective, we as scientists in this field oftentimes don't do a great job at using precise terminology. And so, if you read my Twitter thread, you will see I push back whenever I see somebody in the scientific realm talking about curing aging or reversing aging or living to 200. I think as scientists, especially, we need to be very careful to set the right expectations and not to come off as snake oil salesmen. And I think that has been a challenge for the field. So I hope that we can do better. I know we can do better. I hope we will do better. So in terms of what I think, will potentially be a watershed moment for the field, I really think it'll be the first regulatory approval for geroscience intervention, and that'll probably be FDA approval for some indication. Whether or not it gets recognized as a drug that as a aging. So I don't think aging is going to be the end point. I don't think lifespan, at least in people, is going to be the end point. But if everybody knows that is the path that this intervention took to FDA approval, I think that'll really have a huge impact on the field, both in terms of public perception of the field and also influx of resources from the private sector, right? I think there needs to be a path, and once people see the path, then I think that'll be the moment that the dam breaks. And Nir, obviously, you're leading the charge on the human side. So if TAME is successful, I think that will really be a critical moment. But I think we need other shots on goal, right? TAME can't be the only chance we've got, right? And I think we have those other shots on goal, and they're coming along. But that I think will happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe it'll happen. I'm just going to make a plug for companion animals again, because that's near and dear to me. I think if you can get FDA approval for veterinary medicine as well, and so if we or somebody else is able to actually get approval for healthy lifespan or some collection of age-related endpoints that are measures of health span in companion animals, I think that'll have a big impact too. And I will just say, I've said this before, more than half of the people who own dogs think of their dog as part of their family. So it's not only about getting approval for veterinary medicine, it's about slowing the biology of aging in people's family members. And I think that could have a big impact on the way people think about geroscience.
Terrific. And Zan, I don't need to say anymore because Matt said what I would summarize. I would just say thank you. I think you demonstrated that there's tons of activity now. There's a lot of interest. There's lots of excitement, and that the next decade is probably going to be successful for all of us. So thank you very much.
Nir, I can't thank you enough. You've done more as a single person to catalyze practical results in this field than any other person I can think of.
Zan, flattery will get you nowhere.
I can't help it. It just happens to be true. And the panel that you have assembled is just a reflection of your cloud. And wow, what a panel. I start with Matt just to say amen. I think the dog study can actually provide very persuasive evidence that could actually help to support a similar indication or approval for humans. And I do want to go back to Mehmood's very important point about the ecology that we need to improve for every level of geroscience and therapeutic development, and not just regulated products, but of course for anything that works. It's going to take many different things, including Congress. It's going to need to think about patent term extension, tax credits. The private sector has been well addressed. We're going to need FDA to revise its thinking and even to put more resources into building staff that will be receptive to developing health span indications. So it's going to take a village to achieve this kind of ecology that will ultimately make the big difference. To get health span products to people who need them now, to get them in our lifetimes. And I mean, folks like me who have less time to go than Sergey, but certainly we all will benefit from these achievements where we get discoveries made into products. And so again, we can't thank you enough for this terrific panel.